Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world stripped of all the noise you know. No car engines humming in the distance. No refrigerators buzzing in the kitchen. No phones vibrating on nightstands. No ambient hum of electricity running through walls. Just silence. Deep, tangible silence, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you aware of your own breathing. Now, into that silence, add something small. The soft whisper of sandaled feet on stone floors. The distant murmur of reed beds swaying beyond mud brick walls. And then, if you listen very carefully, you might hear the faint rhythmic scratching of a stylus pressing into damp clay. That sound, quiet as a secret, is the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Welcome to the world of ancient librarians, men and women, whose names have been swallowed by millennia, whose faces we will never see, but whose patient, repetitive work created something extraordinary. They didn't fight in battles or build towering monuments. They didn't write epic poems or discover new lands. What they did was simpler, stranger, and somehow more profound. They organized clay tablets, day after day, year after year. Sometimes for their entire lives. These weren't ordinary tablets, of course. Each one was a small rectangle of river clay, roughly the size of your palm, covered in hundreds of tiny wedge-shaped marks. These marks pressed carefully into the soft surface before it dried were cuneiform, one of humanity's first writing systems, and each tablet was a fragment of memory made permanent. A merchant's accounts, a king's decree, a student's multiplication tables, a poem about gods and floods and the meaning of mortality. The librarians who managed these tablets lived in a world we can barely comprehend, a world where information couldn't be copied with a button press, where knowledge moved at the speed of human hands, where preservation required not just intention but extraordinary patience. To save a text meant to copy it, sign by sign, tablet by tablet, and then to file it away in exactly the right spot so that it might be found again perhaps years later, perhaps by someone else, perhaps after you yourself had turned to dust. There's something profoundly calming about this work. When you really think about it, in our age of endless stimulation and algorithmic chaos, where information floods past us faster than we can absorb it, there's an almost meditative quality to imagining these ancient workers bent over their clay, focused entirely on the task at hand, one tablet at a time, one cuneiform sign at a time, one careful placement on one specific shelf in one specific room. They worked by oil lamp when the sun set too early. They breathed air thick with clay dust. Their fingers developed calluses in the exact shape of their tools. They knew the weight of wet clay versus fired clay. They knew which tablets were too damaged to save and which could be copied one more time before crumbling away. They knew the smell of the kill and the particular silence of a storage room filled floor to ceiling with organized human thought. And here's the beautiful thing. The thing that makes this story perfect for drifting off to sleep. Their work was boring. Deliberately, beautifully, hypnotically boring. It had to be. Excitement means variation, and variation means error. These librarians sought the opposite: consistency, repetition, the soothing rhythm of routine, elevated into ritual. They were the guardians of stability in a world that was anything but stable. Empires rose and fell around them. Kings conquered and were conquered. Rivers flooded. Temples burned. But in the quiet rooms where the tablets were kept, the work continued, filing, cataloging, preserving, creating order from the chaos of human experience, one small clay rectangle at a time. So, tonight, as you settle into comfort and let your thoughts begin to slow, imagine yourself there, not as a warrior or a ruler, but as one of these patient keepers of memory. Feel the cool clay in your hands. Hear the soft scratch of the stylus. Smell the dust and lamp oil. And let yourself sink into the profound piece of work that matters precisely because it is slow, careful, and relentlessly, wonderfully ordinary. The library waits. The tablets are ready. And somewhere in the gathering darkness of ancient Mesopotamia, a lamp flickers to life, casting shadows across rows and rows of carefully organized human memory. Let's step inside If we're going to understand the world of ancient librarians, we need to visit the place where their craft reached its most refined form. We need to travel back for 1,000 years to a city that no longer exists except as mounds of earth and broken pottery, but which once stood as the intellectual heart of Mesopotamia. We need to go to Nippur. Nippur sits in what is now central Iraq, roughly halfway between Baghdad and Busra, in the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But in 2000 BCE, Nippur wasn't just a city, it was the city, at least in matters of learning and religion. While other cities like Ur and Babylon competed for political dominance, Nippur remained apart, neutral, sacred. It was never a capital, never the seat of empire. Instead, it was something more lasting, a place of priests, scribes, and scholars. A place where knowledge was kept. Imagine approaching Nippur on foot, as a traveler might have done. The landscape is almost painfully flat, broken only by irrigation ditches and date palms. The sun is relentless, a white disk in a pale sky. You walk along a raised path beside a canal, the water moving sluggishly, reflecting nothing but light. And then gradually, you see it, the city rising from the plain. Its mud brick walls the same tawny color as the earth itself, so that from a distance it seems to have grown rather than been built. The walls are massive, 30 feet high in places, built from millions of sun-dried bricks. As you draw closer, you hear the city before you see inside it the bleating of goats, the calls of merchants, the rhythmic thud of someone pounding grain. The air smells of wood smoke and date wine and donkey dung and something else, something harder to identify, the dry, slightly acrid scent of old clay. You enter through a gate flanked by guards who barely glance at you. Inside, the streets are narrow, winding, shadowed by overhanging second stories and palm frond awnings. Children chase each other around corners. Women carry water jars balanced perfectly on their heads. A scribe sits cross-legged outside a merchant's house, taking dictation for someone who cannot write. And everywhere the same warm tan color mud brick and clay and dust. The entire city built from the same river mud that surrounds it. But you're not here for the markets or the residential quarters. You're here for the temple complex. The Temple of Enlil, King of the Gods, Lord of Wind and Storm, dominates Nippur's skyline. Its ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, rises over 100 feet into the Mesopotamian sky. But the ziggurat itself isn't where we're going. Instead, we're heading to the smaller buildings clustered around its base. Buildings that from the outside look utterly unremarkable. Low, rectangular structures with small windows designed to keep out the killing heat of summer. These are the temple's administrative buildings. And hidden within them is one of the ancient world's greatest treasures. Library, step inside with me. The transition from bright sunlight to interior dimness is momentarily blinding. Your eyes adjust slowly. The temperature drops immediately. These thick walls keep out the heat remarkably well. The floor is hard-packed earth covered in red mats. And the smell. That smell you noticed from outside is much stronger here. It's the smell of thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Some still slightly damp, others fired hard as stone. Others crumbling slowly back into dust. The room you've entered is not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30. But every available surface is covered with tablets. They line the walls on brick shelving, stacked carefully according to a system you don't yet understand. They sit in woven baskets, they fill wooden crates. And in the center of the room, at a low table, a figure sits cross-legged, working by the light of an oil lamp even though it's midday. This is a librarian scribe, and he doesn't look up as you enter. He's copying something, his stylus moving with practiced precision across the surface of a fresh tablet, his lips moving slightly as he silently reads the text he's reproducing. The silence here is extraordinary. Outside, Nippur bustles and chatters and lives. In here, the only sounds are the breathing of the scribe, the faint hiss of the oil lamp, and occasionally the soft scrape of clay against clay as a tablet is moved. This is a place designed for concentration, for the slow, meticulous work of preservation along one wall. You notice something curious: small clay tags, each about the size of a bookmark, pressed into the bricks themselves. These are shelf labels, you realize. Each one bears a brief cuneiform inscription. Omens, dreams, hymns, Enlil, royal correspondence, Yurnamu, mathematical tables. The library is organized intentionally, carefully organized according to categories that made sense to these ancient minds. There are other rooms beyond this one, you discover. A room where clay is prepared, basins of water, piles of raw clay from the river, workbenches with tablets in various stages of completion. A room that's essentially a kill, thick with smoke during firings, where tablets too important to risk water damage are baked into permanence. And another room, smaller, with a door that locks, where the most precious texts are kept, the canonical versions of myths and religious texts, the master copies from which all others are made. This is Nipper's library, though they wouldn't have called it that. They might have called it the House of Tablets, or simply the storage room of Enlil's temple. But whatever the name, its function was clear: to gather, preserve, organize, and transmit human knowledge. Everything that mattered to their civilization passed through rooms like this one. Treaties between city-states, laws governing marriage and trade, the secrets of calculating the movement of planets, stories about heroes and floods and the creation of the world, and maintaining all of this, keeping it organized, keeping it accessible, keeping it from crumbling into dust, acquired a special kind of person. Not necessarily the most brilliant scribe or the most powerful priest. What it required was someone with patience, with attention to detail, with a tolerance for repetitive work, and with a deep, abiding respect for the importance of order. It required librarians, as you stand in that cool, dim room breathing the dust of 4,000-year-old information. You begin to understand something crucial. This place is boring in exactly the way a monastery is boring, or a garden carefully tended for decades, or a stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. It's boring because it has achieved something rare and precious: stability, consistency, a refuge from chaos. The scribe at the table finishes his line, wipes his stylus carefully on a damp cloth, and finally looks up at you. His eyes are tired. His beard is graying. He's probably in his 40s, which makes him old by the standards of his time. He's been doing this work for 25 years. He doesn't smile. But there's something in his expression, not pride, exactly, but a quiet satisfaction. He knows where everything is. He knows which tablets are duplicates and which are unique. He knows which ones are falling apart and need to be copied before their text is lost forever. He knows this room better than he knows the streets of his own neighborhood. And when he dies, perhaps in 5 years, perhaps in 10, another scribe will take his place. The work will continue. The tablets will accumulate. The library will grow. Because that's what libraries do. They outlive their keepers. They preserve what individual memory cannot. But for now, in this moment, in this room, there is only the present, the lamp, the clay, the careful hands, and the endless, patient work of remembering. Before there were libraries, before there were even books, there was a simpler question. How do you make words last? It's easy to forget. In our age of digital permanence, or at least the illusion of permanence that for most of human history, language disappeared the moment it was spoken. A story told around a fire existed only as long as people remembered it. A trade agreement was only as reliable as the memories of the people who made it. And memory, as every human quickly discovers, is unreliable. It fades, it distorts, it dies with the people who hold it. So somewhere, sometime around 3200 BCE, in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, someone had a revolutionary idea. What if you could take the soft river mud, the same mud that was everywhere, that clogged the irrigation ditches and built up behind the dams, that was both curse and blessing, and use it to capture language, to make words visible, to give speech a body that could outlive the speaker? This is where our story truly begins, in the invention of clay tablets and the cuneiform script pressed into them. And to understand the librarians who devoted their lives to organizing these tablets, you first need to understand the tablets themselves, how they were made, why they worked, and what it felt like to create something so fragile and yet so permanent. Let's start with the clay itself. Mesopotamian clay comes from the rivers, particularly the Euphrates, which carries sediment down from the mountains of Anatolia. When the river floods, which it does unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically, it deposits this sediment across the floodplain. The clay is fine-grained, smooth, and when properly prepared, remarkably plastic. It holds an impression perfectly. This matters more than you might think. Try scratching writing into sand and it crumbles. Try marking stone without metal tools, and it's nearly impossible. But clay, wet clay, accepts marks easily and holds them as it dries. Preparing the clay is the first step, and it's more complicated than simply scooping mud from a riverbank. The raw clay contains impurities, bits of red, small stones, sand that need to be removed. So the clay is mixed with water in large basins, stirred thoroughly, and allowed to settle. The heaviest impurities sink first. Then the water is carefully poured off, leaving behind a layer of fine, pure clay. This refined clay is then mixed with a small amount of temper, usually chaff from threshed grain, though sometimes finely ground potsherds or sand. The temper serves two purposes. It makes the clay less sticky and easier to work with. And more importantly, it prevents cracking as the tablet dries. Pure clay shrinks as it loses water, and that shrinkage can cause fractures. The temper creates a kind of internal skeleton that holds the clay. Together, the result is a material that feels alive in your hands. It's cool and slightly damp. It has weight, but not much. A typical tablet might weigh just a few ounces. You can feel it wanting to take shape, to be formed. And that's exactly what the scribe does, to create a tablet. The scribe takes a lump of prepared clay about the size of a tennis ball for a standard tablet. Though sizes varied depending on purpose and works, it briefly with both hands, warming it, pressing out any air bubbles, assessing its consistency. Too wet and it won't hold a clean impression. Too dry and it will crack. The scribe, through years of practice, knows the exact right consistency by feel alone. Then comes the shaping. Using practiced economical movements, the scribe presses and smooths the clay into a rectangular form. The most common tablets are roughly rectangular, slightly convex, thicker in the middle than at the edges, like a very subtle pillow. This shape is surprisingly practical. It's comfortable to hold. The curved surface makes it easier to read when held at an angle. And the thicker center is less likely to crack than a completely flat tablet would be. The smoothing is done with wet fingers or a flat piece of wood or bone. The goal is a surface that's completely smooth, without any irregularities that might distort the writing. This process takes only a minute or two, but it requires a kind of focused attention, a preparation of both the material and the mind. The scribe knows that once writing begins, there's no going back. Clay tablets can't be erased easily. Errors have to be either smoothed out completely and the tablet reshaped, or simply copied over again on a new tablet. Now the tablet is ready. And now the real work begins. The tool used to write cuneiform is called a stylus. In Sumerian, it was called gi, which also means reed, because that's what it was made from, carefully cut and shaped reed, usually about the length of a pencil. The tip is triangular in cross-section, cut at an angle so that when pressed into the clay, it makes a wedge-shaped mark. That's what cuneiform means, wedge-shaped, from the Latin cuneus, wedge. The scribe holds the stylus delicately, almost like a brush between thumb and first two fingers, and then referring either to memory or to another tablet that's being copied. The writing begins. Each cuneiform sign is made up of multiple wedge impressions pressed into the clay in a specific sequence. A sign might consist of 2 wedges, or 5, or even 10 or more. Some signs are logograms. They represent whole words. Others are syllables. Still others are determinatives, signs that aren't pronounced but tell you how to interpret the signs around them. It's a complex system, the product of centuries of evolution. And to use it fluently requires years of training. But what you'd notice watching a skilled scribe work is the rhythm. The stylus touches the clay, presses, lifts, touches, presses, lifts. There's a sound to it, a soft, almost musical tapping, like very quiet rain on leaves. The scribe's hand moves steadily across the tablet, left to right, top to bottom. The signs emerge in neat rows, each one properly spaced, each one clear and distinct. The scribe doesn't press too hard that would create ugly, over-deep marks and might even push through the tablet entirely. But neither does the scribe press too lightly. The marks need to be deep, enough to remain legible even after the tablet dries and shrinks slightly. Finding the right pressure is something that comes only with practice. An unconscious calibration of force that skilled scribes perform automatically as the tablet fills with text. Something almost magical happens. These clusters of wedge marks begin to hold meaning. They stop being patterns pressed into mud and become language instructions, stories, numbers, prayers. The clay begins its transformation into something more than clay. It becomes memory made tangible. When the writing is complete, the tablet is set aside to dry. This is a crucial, delicate stage. If dried too quickly, say in direct sunlight, the tablet will crack. The water in the clay needs to evaporate slowly and evenly. So tablets are typically dried in a shaded area with good air circulation. Depending on humidity and temperature, this might take anywhere from a few days to a week or more. A dried clay tablet is surprisingly durable. It's hard, though not as hard as fired pottery. You can still scratch it with a fingernail if you try, but it's resilient enough to be handled, transported, and stored. Many tablets were used in this unfired state, especially documents that were meant to be temporary ROI seats, letters, student exercises. If such a tablet was no longer needed, it could be dropped in a bucket of water, dissolved back into clay, and reused. Economy was important in a world where even clay had to be prepared with effort. But some tablets, the important ones, the ones that contained knowledge meant to last, were fired. Firing transforms clay irreversibly. The heat drives out all the remaining water. Not just the free water between clay particles, but also the molecular water that's part of the clay's chemical structure. This process, which occurs at temperatures above about 400 degrees Celsius, makes the clay incredibly hard and durable. A properly fired tablet can survive being dropped, can withstand moisture, and can last for thousands of years. The tablets we have in museums today, the ones you can look at and sometimes even hold, are survivors. They've outlasted the cities that produced them, the empires that commissioned them, and the languages written on them. The firing itself was done in kilns. Simple structures of brick or clay with a fire pit at the bottom and a chamber above where tablets were stacked. The process took hours, gradually heating the tablets, maintaining high temperature, then slowly cooling them. Rush the cooling and they'd crack. But done correctly, what emerged from the kiln was permanent as anything humans have ever created. There's something profound in this process when you stop to think about it. The creation of a clay tablet is a negotiation with impermanence. The clay is gathered from a river that's been flowing for millennia. It's shaped by human hands that will last decades at most. It's impressed with words that might be relevant for a year or a century, or if it's a great poem, forever. And then it's transformed by fire into something that can outlive civilizations. Every tablet a librarian filed away represented this arc from mud to memory, from shapeless material to shaped meaning, from temporary to permanent. The librarians understood this in their bones. They handled hundreds of tablets every week. They knew the weight difference between fired and unfired. They knew which tablets were fragile and which could withstand rough treatment. They knew that every tablet they organized was a small victory against forgetting, a small assertion of order against the universe's tendency toward entropy. And they knew, though perhaps they didn't have words for it, that they were participants in something larger than themselves. They were links in a chain of memory that stretched from the past they preserved to a future they'd never see. The clay tablets they filed, so carefully sorted by subject, labeled stored, were messages to that future. Messages that said, "We were here. We thought these things. We wrote them down. We tried to make them last standing in that cool, dim storage room in Nipper, breathing clay dust and lamp smoke." A librarian might have held a newly fired tablet, still warm from the kiln, and felt the satisfaction of adding one more piece to the great archive of human knowledge. One more tablet, one more text preserved. One more small victory against time. The work was boring, repetitive, unglamorous. But it was also, in its own quiet way, heroic. Now that we understand the tablets, how they were made, what they represented, we can finally meet the people who organized them. The first librarians. Though of course they wouldn't have called themselves that. They were scribes, priests, administrators. They were guardians of temple property and royal archivists. They were teachers and copyists and keepers of tradition. But whatever their official titles, their function was clear. They were the people who made knowledge findable, who created order from accumulation, who understood that a room full of tablets was just a room full of clay, lest someone knew where everything was. Let's be clear about something important. We don't know most of their names. The vast majority of librarians who worked in Mesopotamian archives are completely anonymous to us. They didn't sign their organizational systems. They didn't write memoirs about the challenges of cataloging. The clay tags they used to label shelves tell us about categories, not about the people who created those categories. But we do know some names. And from those names, from the colophons, the scribal signatures at the end of copied texts, sand from administrative documents, we can piece together a picture of who these people were and what their lives were like. One of the earliest names we have is Urnanch, a scribe working in the city of Gersu around 2360 BCE. We know he existed because several tablets from the temple archive bear his name, and because one administrative text lists him as keeper of tablets under the governor Antamina. Urnanch wasn't a high priest or a military commander. He was essentially a middle manager in the temple bureaucracy. But his middle management involved overseeing thousands of economic records, grain disbursements, wool allotments, labor assignments. These records needed to be organized so that they could be consulted when disputes arose or when audits were conducted. Urnanch's job was to make sure the right tablet could be found when needed. Imagine his day. He arrives at the temple as the sun rises, the air still cool from the night. He enters the archive room, his room, the space he knows better than anywhere else. Before he does anything else, he inspects the shelves. Has anything fallen? Are there any signs of moisture damage? Any evidence of mice or insects? The preservation of tablets is a constant battle against decay. Vigilance is required. Then he reviews the tablets that arrived yesterday. New records from the field stallies of barley harvests. A contract involving a boat rental. A record of silver paid to craftsmen. Each of these needs to be filed appropriately. The harvest records go with other agricultural documents sorted by year and by field. The boat contract goes with transportation records. The silver payment goes with craft worker accounts, but it's not quite that simple. Some tablets contain multiple types of information. A harvest record might also mention a debt owed by a farmer. Does it get filed with agricultural records or with debt records? Urnanch has to decide. And whatever he decides becomes precedent, becomes part of the system he's building. This is the invisible intellectual work of librarianship, creating categories, making judgment calls about what belongs with what, establishing conventions that others will follow. It's not glamorous work. There are no dramatic moments. But every time Urnanch makes a filing decision, he's shaping how information will be accessed for decades to come. As the centuries passed and as libraries grew more sophisticated, the role of the librarian scribe became more formalized. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian period around 700 BCE, we have evidence of professional archivists with specific training and responsibilities. One of the most famous is Nebuchadnezzar, whose name appears in the colophons of several tablets from the royal library at Nineveh. He identifies himself as junior scribe or sometimes tablet keeper in the service of King Ashurbanipal. From the texts associated with him, we can tell that his job involved not just copying tablets, but also acquiring them from other cities, checking copies against originals for accuracy, and organizing them within the library NAC. U-ZUQUP-KENU lived at a fascinating moment in library history. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king, was obsessed with collecting texts. He sent agents throughout his empire with orders to find and copy every text they could. Find religious rituals from Babylonian temples, omen series from divination archives, medical treatises, astronomical tables, literary texts. It was an ancient version of universal collection, an attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place. This meant that librarians like Nabusu Kenu were dealing with an unprecedented organizational challenge. Tablets were arriving from dozens of different cities, produced by scribes with different conventions, treating subjects in different ways. How do you organize that? How do you make it accessible? The solution they developed was remarkably sophisticated. They created categorical divisions: mythology, omens, medicine, astronomy, laws, royal inscriptions, letters, and within each category, they developed subcategories. Medical texts were divided by type of ailment. Omens were divided by type of phenomenon observed. Literary texts were grouped by genre and by main character. They also created something like a catalog system. Small tablets or tags were created that listed the contents of a particular shelf or basket. These tags would include the first line of each text stored there, which served as the title of the work. Since ancient texts didn't have titles in our modern sense, and sometimes additional information like the number of tablets in a series or the condition of the tablet. Think about what this means. Without any computers, without any index cards, without even paper, these librarians created a system that allowed King Ashurbanipal to find specific texts among tens of thousands of tablets. If the king wanted to know what omens applied to a lunar eclipse, the librarians could direct him to the right series. If he wanted to read a particular myth, they could produce the tablets in the correct order. This required not just organizational skill, but also extraordinary memory. The librarians had to know the system intimately. They had to remember where things were, what categories existed, which texts had multiple copies, and which were unique. They were, in a very real sense, living catalogs. But let's not romanticize too much. This was still day-to-day, boring work. Most of what these librarians did was routine: filing new tablets, retrieving requested tablets, checking on the condition of stored tablets, making copies of damaged tablets before they became unreadable. The same tasks, repeated endlessly. The same walk from storage room to scribal desk, the same careful placement of tablet on shelf. And yet, there's something almost monastic about this routine. The librarians were preserving something larger than themselves. They were maintaining an intellectual inheritance that stretched back centuries. Every properly filed tablet was a node in a vast network of knowledge. A network that existed because people like Urnanch and Nabusa Kenu showed up day after day and did the unglamorous work of maintaining order. They trained apprentices, passing on not just the technical skills of reading and writing, but also the organizational principles of the archive. They dealt with damaged tablets, making decisions about what could be saved and what needed to be copied. They negotiated with other scribes about how to classify ambiguous texts. They probably had disagreements about filing systems, about whether certain texts belonged in one category or another. In other words, they dealt with exactly the kinds of boring administrative questions that librarians have dealt with throughout history. The medium has changed from clay to papyrus to parchment to paper to digital files. But the essential problem remains the same. How do you organize information so that it can be found again? The ancient Mesopotamian librarians solved this problem with remarkable effectiveness. The proof is that we can still read their tablets today, can still understand their categorical systems, can still appreciate the logic of their organization. When archaeologists excavate ancient libraries and find tablets still arranged on shelves according to subject, they're witnessing the success of organizational systems. Designed thousands of years ago, these librarians knew something that's easy to forget in our age of algorithmic search and instant access. Information without organization is just noise. 1,000,000 tablets in a room are useless if you can't find the one you need. But 1,000 tablets, properly categorized, properly labeled, properly stored, become a library, become a tool for thought. become a way of preserving and transmitting culture across generations. And so they showed up. Day after day in those cool, dim rooms filled with clay and dust. They filed tablets. They created labels. They maintained order. They did the boring, essential work that made civilization possible. As the lamp flickers and the shadows lengthen across the shelves, you can almost see them, still nameless figures bent over their work, styluses in hand, surrounded by the accumulated memory of their world. Patient, methodical, forgotten by history, but essential to history. The first librarians performing the first and most important act of culture, remembering, and making it possible for others to remember too. Now we come to the heart of it. The truly magnificently boring center of our story. We come to the actual practical question that these ancient librarians had to answer every single day. Where does this tablet go? It's the kind of question that makes eyes glaze over. It's the kind of mundane problem that no one writes epic poems about. But solving this question, developing systems to answer it consistently, is what transformed rooms full of clay into actual libraries. It's what made knowledge accessible across generations. And understanding how they did it gives us a window into a kind of intelligence that's often overlooked. The intelligence of organization. The genius of boring consistency. Let's start with the physical reality. Imagine you're standing in one of those storage rooms in Nippur or Nineveh. The room is roughly rectangular, maybe 20 feet by 40 feet, with walls of mud brick 3 feet thick. There are no windows. Windows would let in dust, and the occasional rain, just a door, and perhaps a few small high vents for air circulation. The light comes from oil lamps, smoky and dim. Against every wall, there are shelves. These aren't sophisticated, built-in bookshelves like in a modern library. They're simpler, brick pillars supporting wooden planks. Or sometimes just brick courses built out from the walls to create ledges at different heights. The shelves are shallow, perhaps 6 inches deep, because tablets don't need much depth. They're designed to hold tablets upright, or nearly upright, like books on a modern shelf, so you can see the edge of each tablet. The tablets themselves vary in size. Most are small, palm-sized, easy to hold and read. But some particularly royal inscriptions or important literary works are larger, the size of a modern tablet computer. And a few are huge, so large that they require 2 hands to lift. It's typically used for important commemorative texts or texts that will be publicly displayed. Now, you're the librarian. Tablets arrive regularly. They arrive from the scribal school next door, where students have been copying standard texts. They arrive from scribes who've been recording the day's administrative activities, temple offerings, field measurements, legal cases heard in the gate. They arrive as gifts or acquisitions from other cities. Some days, a dozen new tablets. Other days, just 1 or 2. Each one needs to find its home, the first and most. Fundamental organizational principle is categorical division. Tablets are grouped by broad subject matter, and here's where it gets interesting. Because the categories these ancient librarians created reveal how they understood knowledge itself. The basic categories, which we can reconstruct from shelf tags and catalog tablets found in excavations, included mythology and religion, hymns to specific gods, prayers and incantations, myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish creation story, ritual instructions for festivals and ceremonies. This was often the largest category in temple libraries because religious knowledge was central to the temple's function. Asterisk, asterisk. Omens and divination, asterisk, asterisk. This was a huge category in Mesopotamian libraries, reflecting the importance of divination in decision-making. It included omen series based on astronomical observations, liver divination, birth omens, dream interpretation. These texts were organized into standardized series, often running too many tablets. For example, the astrological omen series called Enuma, Anu, and Lel consisted of at least 70 tablets. Asterisk, asterisk, law and administration, asterisk, asterisk, royal edicts. Law codes, legal precedents, contracts, treaties, administrative records, grain distributions, worker assignments, tax receipts. This category reflects the bureaucratic sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization. They documented everything: medicine and healing, diagnostic texts, prescriptions, magical healing incantations. Medical texts often combine what we'd consider rational empirical treatment with magical religious approaches. And the librarians didn't distinguish between them to Mesopotamian thinking. They were all part of healing knowledge: mathematics and astronomy, mathematical tables, multiplication, division, square roots, cube roots, problem texts, teaching mathematical techniques, astronomical observations, and prediction tables. The mathematical sophistication of Mesopotamian scholars was extraordinary, and the tablets reflect it. Literature and wisdom. Beyond the religious mythology, there were secular literary works: proverbs, fables, dialogues, school debates. These were texts meant not for ritual use, but for education and contemplation. Asterisk, asterisk. Lexical lists and dictionaries. Asterisk, lists of cuneiform signs with their pronunciations and meanings. Bilingual vocabularies translating between Sumerian and Akkadian. Lists of trees, animals, stones, professions, organized lists of essentially everything in the world. These were teaching tools, but also reference works. Within each of these major categories, there were subcategories. Medical texts were divided by type of illness: eye problems, digestive issues, fever, childbirth. Omens were divided by source: celestial, terrestrial, personal. Literary texts were grouped by genre, and here's where the filing gets really interesting. The librarians developed a kind of call number system, though not numerical like our Dewey Decimal System. Instead, they used the first line of a text as its identifier. In Mesopotamian practice, texts didn't have titles in the modern sense. Instead, you'd refer to a text by its incipit, its opening words. So the Epic of Gilgamesh was known as Shah Nakba Imuru, he who saw the deep, because that's how it begins. A medical text might be referred to as if a man's head throbs, because that's its first line. This system worked because scribes could memorize these incipits. A librarian didn't need to read the entire tablet to know what it was, just recognize the first line. And the shelf tags would list these incipits. So you could scan a tag and know what was on that shelf. Physical placement followed categorical logic. The most frequently used text: standard religious texts. Common administrative forms might be placed on shelves at easy-to-reach heights between waist and shoulder level. Rare texts, or texts in poor condition that weren't handled often, might go on higher or lower shelves. Large tablets had their own designated areas, often stored flat rather than upright. Some texts came in series multiple tablets that together formed a longer work. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, was traditionally divided across 12 tablets. These series tablets were kept together, in order, sometimes in special containers. A basket or wooden box might hold an entire series, the tag attached identifying its contents. The level of detail and organization could be extraordinary. In Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, archaeologists found that not only were tablets categorized by subject, but within categories, they were sometimes arranged by source city. Texts acquired from Babylon were grouped separately from texts acquired from Uruk. This allowed scholars to compare different versions of the same text. To study regional variations in religious practice or literary tradition, there's evidence. Some tablets have marks indicating they'd been removed from the library and borrowed. Small tags might be left in place of a removed tablet, noting who took it and when. This was crucial in royal libraries, where courtiers and scholars might take tablets for consultation. The librarian needed to know where everything was, even the things that weren't currently in the library. Duplicate handling was another challenge. Many texts existed in multiple copies, backup copies in case of damage, copies acquired from different cities. How do you file duplicates? The Mesopotamian solution seems to have been to keep one master copy in the main collection and store duplicates elsewhere, perhaps in a separate room or section. The master would be the most accurate, often fire-hardened for preservation, while duplicates might be kept in unfired clay, easily replaceable. Damaged tablets presented special problems. A tablet that was cracking or crumbling couldn't just be thrown away if it contained important information. The standard practice was to copy the damaged tablet onto a fresh one, then store the original separately with a notation about its condition. Over time, this created a kind of conservation section, areas where fragile originals were kept under optimal conditions, while working copies circulated. There's something almost touching about finding evidence of these preservation efforts. Scholars have found tablets carefully wrapped in reed matting, tablets placed in protective clay envelopes, tablets stored in sealed jars to protect them from moisture. The librarians understood that they were fighting a losing battle against entropy. Eventually crumbles. Ink fades, knowledge dissipates, but they fought it anyway. One careful preservation decision at a time. The spatial organization of these libraries also reflected hierarchies of importance. In temple libraries, religious texts were often stored in the innermost, most secure rooms, sometimes in chambers that required passing through multiple doorways. Administrative and secular texts might be in more accessible outer rooms. This wasn't just about security. It was about sacred geography. The most holy knowledge was kept closest to the temple's holy center, and all these systems. All these decisions about categorization and placement and preservation had to exist primarily in the librarians' heads. There were shelf tags, yes, and catalog tablets, but these were mnemonic aids, not comprehensive databases. The real catalog was human memory, maintained through daily practice. It's transmitted from master librarian to apprentice through years of training. Imagine being that apprentice. You follow your teacher through the dimly lit storage rooms. He points to a shelf and says, Omen texts, series Enuma, Anu, Enlil. Tablets 40 through 55. Touches another shelf. Medical texts. Eye ailments. Another. Gilgamesh, complete set. Plus 2 variant versions from Uruk. You try to memorize it all? Try to build a mental map that will let you find anything in these rooms in the dark. It takes years. But eventually, it happens. Eventually, the library stops being a confusing maze and becomes a known space. You develop almost a spatial memory of knowledge. Medical texts are over there. Legal texts are that direction. You can walk through the stacks, if we can call them that, and your feet know where to go before your conscious mind does. This is the boring genius at the heart of librarianship. The transformation of physical space into intellectual space. The mapping of knowledge onto place. The creation of systems that make finding possible. It's not exciting. There are no chase scenes through the stacks. No dramatic discoveries. Just day after day of, this tablet goes here, that tablet goes there. This shelf is for astronomical observations. That basket holds legal contracts. And yet, without this boring work, the brilliant work, the poetry, the science, the philosophy would be lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh survives because librarians filed it properly, stored it carefully, and knew where it was when scholars wanted to copy it. Mesopotamian mathematics influenced Greek mathematics because the tablets were preserved and accessible. The law codes that shaped justice for centuries existed as usable texts because someone cataloged them correctly. So as you stand in that ancient storage room, breathing dust and lamp smoke, watching a librarian slot a tablet into its proper place on a shelf, you're witnessing something profound, disguised as something mundane. You're watching order being created from accumulation. You're watching human knowledge being structured, preserved, and made available to the future. The librarian steps back, checks the alignment of the tablets on the shelf, nods with satisfaction. Everything in its place. Everything findable. The work continues. Let's slow down even further now. Let's take the abstract ideas we've been discussing: libraries, filing systems, preservation, and ground them in the specific, mundane reality of a single day. Let's follow one librarian scribe through one ordinary day in ancient Nippur. Around 1800 BCE, nothing dramatic will happen. No kings will visit. No wars will interrupt. It will be, in every sense, a boring day. And that's exactly what makes it worth examining. His name is Enlil Bani. It means Enlil is my creator, a common enough name in a city dedicated to that god. He's 34 years old, which makes him middle-aged by the standards of his time. He's been working in the temple archive for 16 years, since he completed his scribal training at 18. He has a wife, 3 children who survived infancy, and a small house in the scribal quarter of the city. In the hierarchy of the temple, he's neither at the top nor the bottom a senior scribe, experienced and trusted, but not one of the high priests or administrators. The day begins before dawn. Enlil wakes to the sound of his wife, Jiminlil, grinding barley for the morning bread. The air is still cool. It's early spring, the best season in Mesopotamia. After the winter rains, but before the killing heat of summer, he performs his morning ablutions with water from a clay jar, washes his face and hands, runs wet fingers through his beard. His clothes are simple. A long woolen tunic, undyed, tied at the waist with a cloth belt. On his feet, leather sandals worn smooth by years of walking the same stone paths. Breakfast is brief bread, few dates, water. His children are still sleeping. He kisses his wife, steps out into the narrow street, and begins the walk to the temple complex. The city is just waking. A few other early risers nod to him in greeting. A dog trots past on some important dog business. The eastern sky is turning from black to deep blue, stars still visible but fading. The temple complex looms ahead, the ziggurat a dark mass against the brightening sky. Enlil enters through a side gate that's always open for temple personnel. He crosses a courtyard where pigeons are already beginning to forage for dropped grain. And then he's at the door of his workplace, a low building of mud brick, unmarked, unremarkable. The door is unlocked. He's not the first to arrive. Inside, another scribe is already working by lamplight. They exchange quiet greetings. This isn't a place for loud conversation. Enlil goes to his designated workspace, a low platform with a reed mat near one of the small windows. He lights his own oil lamp, a small clay bowl with a wick floating in sesame oil. The flame is tiny but steady, casting a circle of warm light onto the clay tablet he'll be working on. But first, before any work begins, there's a ritual. Enlil faces the small shrine in the corner of the room, just a niche in the wall holding a clay figurine of Nizibah, the goddess of writing and scribes. He bows his head, murmurs a brief prayer. Nizibah, wise lady of the tablet, guide my hand. Let my stylus move correctly. Let me make no errors that would shame my craft. It's a prayer he's said thousands of times. The words are automatic, but the gesture matters. He's acknowledging that writing is sacred, that the work he does connects to something larger than himself. Now, the work begins. Today's main task is copying. There's a stack of older tablets on the shelf beside his workspace. Administrative texts from 30 years ago that are beginning to crumble. They need to be recopied before the text becomes unreadable. This is one of the essential, never-ending tasks of the archive. Fighting decay. Maintaining the continuous chain of textual transmission, Enlil takes the first tablet from the stack and examines it carefully. It's a grain distribution record from the temple's agricultural lands. The clay is dry and dusty. Several edges have chipped away, but the text is still mostly legible in cuneiform recording. How many measures of barley went to which workers during the harvest season of year 8 of King Rimson? He sets the old tablet on a reading stand, just a small wooden frame that holds it at an angle. Then he reaches for his prepared clay. The temple has workers who do nothing but prepare clay mixing, campering, aging it to the proper consistency, who leave fresh lumps of it wrapped in damp cloths for the scribes each morning. Enlil unwraps one lump, roughly the size of his fist, and begins to work it with his hands. This is where the tactile knowledge of 16 years comes in. He doesn't think about what he's doing. His hands know. They knead the clay, warming it, finding the right consistency. Too much moisture would make the marks blurry. Too little would make the clay brittle. His hands shape it automatically into the standard rectangular form, slightly convex, smooth on both surfaces. When the fresh tablet is ready, He positions it in front of him. His stylus, a reed cut and shaped to his preference. One he's been using for 3 years, is already in his hand. And now begins the careful work of copying. He reads a line from the old tablet. 100 measures of barley, distributed to the workers of the lower field. His eyes take in the cuneiform signs. His mind translates them from visual marks to linguistic meaning and back to visual marks again. And his hand begins to press the stylus into the fresh clay, recreating each sign. The motion is precise, practiced, almost meditative. Touch, press, lift. Touch, press, lift. The wedge-shaped marks emerge in neat rows. He doesn't copy sign by sign, that would be too slow. Instead, he reads in phrases, holding several words in his memory, then reproducing them. His eyes move between the old tablet and the new one, checking, verifying. Time passes. The sun rises higher, and the light from the window begins to supplement the lamplight. Other scribes arrive and begin their own work. The room fills with the soft sound of styluses on clay, that gentle, rhythmic tapping. That's the signature sound of cuneiform being written. Lull finishes the first tablet after about an hour. He compares it carefully with the original, line by line, making sure he hasn't made any errors. Then he writes a colophon at the bottom, tablet copied by Lull, scribe of Enlil's temple, from the original of year 8 of King Rimson, now worn and damaged. Month of harvest, year 3 of King Hammurabi. The colophon serves multiple purposes. It identifies who made the copy and when, which matters for establishing authenticity. It notes that this is a copy, not an original. And it gives the dating of both the original and the copy, which helps track the archive's history. A century from now, another scribe might look at this tablet and see Lull's name, might recognize him as a link in the chain of textual transmission. The fresh tablet is set aside to dry. Lull takes the next tablet from the stack and begins the process again. Around midday, there's a break. The scribes leave the workspace and go to a communal area where a simple meal has been prepared. Bread, onions, beer. They sit in the shade of a courtyard wall and eat. The conversation is shop talk. Someone is struggling with a damaged tablet whose text is nearly illegible. Another scribe is complaining about a batch of clay that was poorly prepared to sandy. Lull mentions that he's been assigned to help with the upcoming inventory of the Archiva, major project that happens every few years, where they verify that all the catalog tablets match the actual tablets on the shelves after the meal. There's a brief period of rest. Some of the scribes nap. Lull goes for a short walk through the temple complex, just to rest his eyes and stretch his legs. Copying tablets requires intense focus, and after several hours, your eyes start to ache and your hand cramps. Then it's back to work. But the afternoon brings a different task. A junior priest arrives with a request. He needs several tablets from the Omen series dealing with eclipses. There's going to be a lunar eclipse in 3 days, and the priests need to perform the appropriate rituals. Can Lull locate the relevant texts? This is where Lull's knowledge of the archive becomes crucial. The Omen texts are extensive, hundreds of tablets dealing with different phenomena, but he knows exactly where the eclipse's omens are. He stands and walks to a particular section of the storage room, counts shelves, runs his hand along a row of tablets. His fingers know the slight variations in size and texture. He pulls out 5 tablets, checks the first line of each to verify they're the correct ones, and brings them to the priest. The priest thanks him and carefully carries the tablets away. Lull makes a notation on a small clay tag. He needs to remember that those 5 tablets are out of the archive. Who has them and when they were removed? When they're returned, he'll check them for damage before refiling them. The rest of the afternoon is spent on more copying. Lull completes 3 more grain distribution tablets. His hand is definitely tired. Now there's a familiar ache in the base of his thumb, and his shoulder is stiff from hunching over his work. But he pushes through. The light is beginning to fade. Just 1 more tablet. As the sun sets, the work winds down. The tablets completed today are placed on a special drying shelf, spaced far enough apart that air can circulate around them. Inlobani cleans his stylus carefully, wipes it with a damp cloth to remove clay residue, and stores it in a wooden box with his other tools. He covers the clay he was using with a wet cloth so it doesn't dry out overnight. Before he leaves, performs one final task: a quick inspection of the storage area. He walks between the shelves, eyes scanning, looking for anything out of place. A tablet that's been misshelved. Signs of moisture. Evidence of mice. The archive is his responsibility, and vigilance is part of the job. Everything looks fine. The tablets sit in their neat rows, silent, waiting. Each one a small piece of memory, a fragment of order imposed on chaos. Inlobani feels the satisfaction that comes from a day's work completed. Nothing dramatic happened. No great insights emerged. He copied 4 administrative tablets and retrieved 5 omen texts. But the work was done correctly, and that matters. He extinguishes his lamp, says a brief farewell to the scribe who's staying late, and steps out into the evening air. The temple complex is quieter now. The evening offerings are being made at the ziggurat. He can smell the smoke of burning offerings. Hear the distant chanting of priests. He walks home through streets, now shadowed and cooling. At home, his children greet him with the day's adventures. One caught a frog in an irrigation ditch. Another helped bake bread. His wife has prepared a stew of lentils and onions. They eat together, sitting in their small courtyard as the stars emerge overhead. After the meal, Inlobani sits for a while in the darkness. Too tired to do much but listen to the sounds of the city settling into night. His hands smell of clay. They always smell of clay. The scent has soaked into his skin after 16 years. Even when he washes, it lingers. It's the smell of his profession, his identity. Tomorrow will be much like today. More copying, more filing, more preservation of texts. The same walk to the temple. The same prayer to Nizaba. The same careful, focused work. This is what his life is. Repetition, routine, the patient maintenance of order. It doesn't sound like much when you say it that way. But lying in the darkness, feeling the fatigue in his hands and eyes, Inlobani knows something that's hard to articulate. He knows that the work matters. That the texts he copies today might be read 50 years from now or 100. That the system he maintains, the organized archive, the labeled shelves, the careful records make civilization possible. Trade happens because contracts are recorded and retrievable. Justice happens because laws are written and preserved. Knowledge accumulates because scribes like him copy and organize and maintain. He's not a king or a warrior. He won't be remembered in songs, but he's part of something larger, something that will outlast him. The library will continue after he's gone. Other scribes will walk between those same shelves, work at that same station, feel the same clay in their hands. The work continues. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. One tablet at a time. One careful mark at a time. The boring, essential, sacred work of remembering. He closes his eyes. Sleep comes quickly, and in the morning he'll wake and do it all again. Not all libraries were created equal in the ancient world. While temple archives like those in Nippur served primarily religious and local administrative functions, there existed another category of library altogether, the royal archive. These were collections assembled not by priests for the glory of gods, but by kings for the glory of themselves. And yet, paradoxically, these exercises in royal ego created some of the most important preservation projects in human history, the greatest of all royal. Library is the one that survives most completely in the historical record is the Library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. His library, housed in his palace at Nineveh, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq, was an obsessive attempt to collect every text in his empire. And the librarians who built and maintained it faced challenges that would have been unthinkable to their counterparts in temple archives. Imagine the difference in scale and purpose. A temple archive grows organically over decades or centuries. Texts are created locally, copied locally, filed locally. The librarians know the texts intimately because they've often copied them themselves or watched them being created. The archive serves a specific community, the priests and scribes of that particular temple. But Ashurbanipal's library was something else entirely. It was systematic acquisition on a massive scale. The king sent out what we might call collecting agents to cities throughout Mesopotamia with orders to find and copy or simply take any text they encountered. Old texts, rare texts, texts in languages that were already ancient. Everything was to come to Nineveh. The orders that survive give us a flavor of this ambition. One letter to an official in Babylonia reads, "Search out and bring to me all the tablets in your possession, all the tablets kept in the temple libraries. Seek especially tablets of omens, of incantations, of healing, and of wisdom that might not exist in Assyria." The tone is imperious. This isn't a request. The king commands, and texts flowed in Nineveh. The result was an archive of staggering proportions. Modern estimates suggest that Ashurbanipal's library contained at least 30,000 tablets, possibly many more. These weren't neatly arranged in a single room. They filled dozens of rooms in the palace complex, organized into different sections by subject matter. Separate rooms, or wings, for different categories. Omen literature in one area, royal inscriptions in another, religious texts in a third. For the librarians managing this collection, the challenges were unprecedented. Texts arrived from Babylon written in Babylonian conventions. Texts from Uruk in Uruk conventions. Ancient Sumerian texts that even the arriving tablets' own scribes barely understood anymore. Medical texts that contradicted each other. Multiple versions of the same myths with significant variations. How do you organize that? How do you even catalog it? The solution they developed, which we can reconstruct from the tablets themselves and from the catalog tablets found in the ruins, was sophisticated. They created what we might call a standardized system of shelf marks and finding aids. Each major text was assigned an identifier based on its first line, the incipit system we discussed earlier. But now this was recorded systematically in catalog tablets that listed all the holdings in a given room or section. These catalog tablets are fascinating documents. They list texts by category, then by incipit, then often add additional information. Number of tablets in the series. Condition of the tablets, where the text was acquired from, whether it's a unique copy or one of several. A catalog entry might read something like, "If a man's head throbs, medical text. 3 tablets acquired from Borsippa, duplicate held in temple section." The librarians also developed a kind of quality control system. When multiple versions of a text arrived from different cities, they would compare them line by line, noting variations. Sometimes they created what we might call a critical edition, a new master copy that incorporated the best readings from multiple sources. With notations about alternative versions, this was scholarly work of a high order, requiring not just organizational skill, but deep textual knowledge. The colophons on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library often reflect this. After the main text, the scribe would add, "Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria." Tablet copied from an original from city name, collated and corrected. Whoever removes this tablet, or writes his name alongside mine, may Ashur and Ninlil strike him down. The threats are interesting. They reflect a concern about theft and alteration, suggesting that the library's holdings were valuable and that their integrity mattered. Running this library required a staff. We don't know exact numbers, but there were almost certainly dozens of scribes working at any given time. Some were specialists in particular types of texts, a scribe who focused on omen literature, another on medical texts, another on royal correspondence. Others were generalists who could work across categories. There was presumably a hierarchy. A chief librarian? We might imagine. Someone with a title like Keeper of Tablets of the King's House, who oversaw the entire operation. Section heads responsible for different subject areas. Senior scribes, who supervised copying and collation. Junior scribes, who did most of the actual copying work. And probably support staff people who prepared clay, maintained lamps, cleaned the rooms. Did the physical labor of moving tablets, the daily work in a royal library, had a different rhythm than in a temple archive? The pressure was greater. The king himself might request a specific text, and failure to locate it quickly would reflect poorly on the staff. There was more variety in the work one day copying a medical text, the next cataloging a shipment of tablets that just arrived from Babylon, the next searching for a particular omen text that a court diviner needed urgently. But the core work was the same: copying, organizing, preserving. The royal context added prestige but didn't change the fundamental nature of the task. Tablets still had to be filed correctly. Damaged tablets still needed to be recopied. The shelves still needed regular inspection. Knowledge still required the same patient. Boring maintenance. What the royal context did add was a certain ambition about comprehensiveness. Temple libraries collected what was relevant to their particular temple's needs. Royal libraries aimed at universality. Ashurbanipal's library was meant to be a complete representation of Mesopotamian knowledge, everything worth knowing, gathered in one place. Of course, this comprehensiveness had limits. Everything worth knowing was defined by the king's interests and prejudices. The library was strong in areas the king cared about: tomens, because he needed to know the will of the gods; medical texts, because everyone worries about illness; royal inscriptions, because they glorified his office; mythology and religious texts, because they legitimized his rule. It was much weaker in everyday economic texts, in private letters, in the mundane records that filled temple archives. Still, the ambition was remarkable, and the organization required to realize it was equally remarkable. Walk through the ruins of Nineveh today, or rather, look at the archaeological reports. Since much has been destroyed, and you can still see the outlines of the palace library. Room after room, each one originally lined with shelves, each shelf originally filled with tablets. The excavators found tablets still in place on shelves, still organized by subject even after 2,500 years, and the violent destruction of the city, that survival, that tablets remained organized even after the palace burned tells you something about how thoroughly the librarians had done their work. The filing system was so logical, so robust, that it's still readable today. Modern scholars can look at where tablets were found and understand the organizational scheme. This room held omen texts. This room held royal correspondence. This section was medical literature. But let's not lose sight of what the day-to-day work actually felt like for the librarians. Yes, they worked in a palace. Yes, they served a powerful king. But most of their time was spent doing exactly what Anelbani did in the Nippur temple, sitting with tablets, copying carefully, filing methodically, maintaining order. Imagine being the scribe tasked with cataloging a shipment of 200 tablets that just arrived from Uruk. You unpack them carefully. They've traveled wrapped in cloth, packed in baskets. You arrange them on a work table. And then you begin. Pick up the first tablet. Read the first line to identify it. Check your existing catalogs to see if you already have this text. If yes, is this a duplicate? Is it a variant version worth keeping? If no, this is a new edition. Which category does it belong to? Where in the collection should it go? Make a notation for the catalog. Physically carry the tablet to its designated spot. Place it on the shelf. Move to the next tablet. Repeat 199 more times. This is boring work. Methodical, repetitive, mentally taxing in a low-key way that's almost harder to sustain than intense concentration. It's the kind of work where your mind wants to wander, but you can't let it, because misfiling a tablet means it's effectively lost. If you can't find it, it might as well not exist. And yet, this boring work is what made Ashurbanipal's library one of the wonders of the ancient world. The comprehensiveness of the collection matters, yes, but without proper organization, comprehensiveness is meaningless. A pile of 30,000 tablets is just a pile. A library of 30,000 properly cataloged tablets is a tool for scholarship, a resource that can be searched, a collection that can be used. The irony, of course, is that all this ambition and effort ultimately ended in fire. When Nineveh fell to the combined forces of Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE, just 15 years after Ashurbanipal's death, the palace was burned. The fire was catastrophic for the city, but accidental salvation for the library. The extreme heat of the burning palace fired the clay tablets, hardening them. preserving them far better than if they'd been left in far. The library that was built to glorify a king survived, precisely because that king's empire fell. The tablets that librarians so carefully organized and preserved have outlasted the palaces. It's the empire, the civilization that created them. And we can read them today, read the omen texts and medical prescriptions and myths and royal boasts because nameless scribes filed them correctly 2,600 years ago. The work was boring. The empire was mighty. The empire fell. The boring work remains. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed much in grand narratives of ancient civilizations: error. Specifically, the errors that ancient librarians and scribes made and how they dealt with them. Because in a medium as unforgiving as clay, mistakes were not just inevitable, they were constant. And the response to those mistakes reveals something profound about patience, humility, and the true nature of preservation work. When you write with a pen on paper, correction is relatively easy. Cross something out. Use an eraser. Start over on a fresh sheet. But clay doesn't work that way. Once you press a mark into damp clay, it's there. You can smooth it out if you catch it immediately, but that disturbs the surface and often leaves traces. You can't simply erase a sign and write over it cleanly. This means that cuneiform scribes had to be incredibly careful. They had to think before marking. They had to proofread mentally before committing stylus to clay. And yet, despite all their training and care, they made mistakes. We know this because we have their mistakes preserved in fired clay, readable today. Some errors are simple slips: a sign omitted, a wedge placed slightly wrong so that one sign becomes a different sign. Imagine copying a long administrative text, hundreds of lines, and you're tired. Your attention wavers for just a moment. Your stylus presses where it shouldn't, or fails to press where it should. A single wedge out of place, and the sign that should read barley now reads silver. The meaning is completely changed. When a scribe noticed such an error immediately, there were a few options. If the tablet was still quite damp, it was sometimes possible to smooth out the area and remark it. But this rarely looked clean. More often, the scribe would simply abandon that tablet, smooth the entire thing back into a lump of clay, and start over. Frustrating, certainly, especially if you were already halfway through a long text. But better than producing an inaccurate copy. If the error wasn't noticed until after the clay had dried somewhat, correction became more difficult. We have tablets that show attempted corrections, additional signs squeezed into margins with explanatory notes. The sign above should be read as this, or error here should be that. These marginal corrections suggest scribes checking their work, comparing against originals, and noting discrepancies. But here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. What happened when errors were discovered? Not by the original scribe, but later by the librarians organizing the archive. A tablet arrives, perhaps copied months ago, perhaps brought from another city. It's filed away. And then, weeks or years later, someone reads it carefully and realizes it contains errors. What do? The standard procedure seems to have been to create a new copy. Mark the erroneous tablet as suspect or damaged, set it aside, and produce a fresh, corrected version. This new version would go into the active collection. While the error-filled original might be kept in a storage area for damaged or superseded tablets, this creates an interesting category in ancient libraries. Tablets that are physically intact but textually flawed. They're not crumbling or broken. They're perfectly readable, but they're wrong. And the librarians had to track this. Had to remember which tablets were accurate and which contained errors. Had to prevent the erroneous versions from being copied again and propagating the error. We have evidence that this tracking happened. Some tablets have notations. Do not copy from this tablet contains errors. See corrected version on shelf location. These notations are the work of librarians trying to maintain textual integrity across generations of copying. They're performing a kind of quality control that required deep knowledge of the collection and careful attention to detail. But errors weren't always so clear-cut. Sometimes different versions of a text existed, and it wasn't clear which was correct. This was especially true for literary and religious texts that existed in oral tradition before being written down, or that had been transmitted through multiple copying cycles in different cities. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, exists in several versions that differ in significant ways. Some episodes appear in one version, but not in others. Specific lines vary. Even the number of tablets in the complete series differs. Which version is correct? The answer, frustratingly, is that they're all correct. They represent different textual traditions, different regional variations, different stages in the epic's evolution for a librarian organizing such texts. This creates a genuine intellectual challenge. Do you try to identify one version as canonical and demote the others? Do you keep all versions but somehow indicate which is primary? Do you even attempt to reconcile the differences? The Mesopotamian solution, at least in well-organized libraries like Ashurbanipal's, was to keep multiple versions but catalog them clearly. Epic of Gilgamesh, Babylonian version. 12 tablets. Epic of Gilgamesh, Old Babylonian fragments. Variant tradition. This required judgment calls about what constituted a distinct version versus just a copy with errors. It required familiarity with textual scholarship. It required, above all, humility about the limits of knowledge and acknowledgement that sometimes you can't determine the correct version. You can only preserve the variants and let future scholars make their own assessments. There's something almost modern about this approach. Contemporary textual scholars do essentially the same thing: preserve variant manuscripts, note differences. Refrain from imposing a single correct version when the textual tradition is genuinely ambiguous. The ancient librarians, working in clay without the benefit of modern editorial theory, arrived at similar practices through necessity and careful thought. Physical damage to tablets created another kind of error, not mistakes in copying, but loss of information through deterioration. A tablet cracks, and several lines become unreadable. A tablet's edge crumbles away, taking text with it. Mice gnaw on tablets. Yes, this happened. There's archaeological evidence. Water damage from a roof leak makes part of a tablet illegible. Dealing with damaged tablets was one of the librarian's most challenging tasks. A slightly damaged tablet might still be readable enough to use as a copying source, but needed to be marked as damaged so that users knew to be cautious. A severely damaged tablet needed to be copied before more text was lost. But how do you copy text that's already partly missing? Sometimes scribes would leave gaps in their copies, indicating with a notation like broken here or X lines missing. Other times, they would attempt reconstruction, filling in missing text based on context or comparison with other versions. But marking these reconstructions clearly, text restored based on parallel passage, a colophon might note. This work assessing damage, deciding what could be saved, prioritizing which damaged tablets needed immediate recopying, required a kind of triage mentality. You couldn't save everything. Time and resources were limited. Which texts were most important? Which were most urgently at risk? These decisions fell to the librarians. They must have weighed heavily. Imagine standing in the storage room, looking at shelves of tablets, some of them visibly deteriorating. You know that if you don't copy that one soon, it will become unreadable. But you also know that copying a long text might take days, and you have so many other duties. Do you stop all other work to preserve this one text? What if an even more important text is also deteriorating? How do you choose? There are no perfect answers to these questions. The librarians made the best decisions they could with the information and resources they had. Sometimes they chose well, and texts survived. Sometimes they didn't, and texts were lost. Sometimes they simply ran out of time. A tablet crumbled away before anyone got around to copying it. And that text vanished from human knowledge. We know this happened because sometimes we have catalog entries that list texts we don't have. A catalog tablet from Ashurbanipal's library mentions a medical text dealing with a specific rare condition. We have the catalog entry. We don't have the text. Somewhere between the catalog being written and the library being destroyed, that text was lost. Perhaps the tablet broke. Perhaps it was misfiled and couldn't be found when copying time came. Perhaps the librarian meant to copy it, but never got to it before the city fell. There's a kind of melancholy in these absences. They represent not just lost texts, but failed preservation efforts. Moments when the boring work of maintenance couldn't keep pace with entropy. The librarians tried. They organized, they filed, they cataloged, they copied damaged texts before they became unreadable. But they were human, finite, working against forces, time, decay, chance that were infinite. And yet what survives is extraordinary. Thousands of tablets, carefully copied, carefully preserved, still readable after millennia. The success rate of ancient preservation work is actually remarkable when you think about it. A significant percentage of what was written down in cuneiform has survived in some form. That survival is due almost entirely to the boring, patient work of scribes and librarians who dealt with errors and damage. One tablet at a time. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond clay tablets. All preservation is a battle against entropy. All archives face the problem of error and decay. Digital files corrupt. Paper crumbles. Hard drives fail. The specific medium changes, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you maintain order and integrity over time in the face of inevitable degradation? The answer, then and now, is the same. Patient, unglamorous, daily maintenance. Check the files. Find the errors. Make corrections. Create backups. Monitor for damage. Prioritize the most important or most at-risk materials. Do this consistently, day after day, year after year. It's boring work. It's essential work. It's the only work that actually preserves anything. So when we look at a clay tablet in a museum, perfectly preserved, text crisp and readable, we should remember what's not visible, the errors that were caught and corrected, the damage that was assessed and addressed, the careful decisions about what to preserve and how, the boring vigilance of librarians who checked and rechecked, who copied and recopied, who fought entropy one tablet at a time. They didn't win every battle, but they won enough of them that we can still read Gilgamesh, still calculate using Babylonian mathematics, still understand their legal systems and religious beliefs. The clay holds not just their knowledge, but evidence of their struggle to preserve it, the corrections, the notations about damage, the colophons that document copying chains. Imperfect preservation is still preservation. Flawed transmission is still transmission. In the humble acknowledgement of error, the willingness to mark mistakes, to create corrections, to note uncertainties is itself a kind of wisdom that we do well to remember. There comes a moment in every civilization when the work stops. When the libraries fall silent, when no one walks between the shelves anymore, no one lights the lamps, no one presses stylus to clay. The great experiment in preservation ends, and the long sleep begins. For the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, this ending came not all at once, but gradually, over centuries, as the world that had created them slowly transformed into something else. Let's drift through this long twilight, this slow fading, and understand how these repositories of knowledge were lost, and how, paradoxically, that loss sometimes saved them. The process began differently in different places. Some libraries ended in violence. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed in the late 7th century BCE, cities like Nineveh were destroyed with catastrophic thoroughness. The palace burned. The walls were torn down. Conquerors wanted not just military victory, but obliteration, the erasure of Assyrian power from memory. When the palace burned, so did everything in Idor, so the destroyers thought. They didn't understand that fire doesn't destroy clay tablets the way it destroys wooden furniture or cloth tapestries. Fire hardens clay, bakes unfired tablets into permanence. So Ashurbanipal's great library, which the conquerors might have intended to destroy, was instead accidentally preserved. The tablets fell from their burning shelves, tumbled into heaps, were buried under collapsed walls and roofing. But they survived, hardened into artifacts that would last millennia. In the moment, though, this was simply destruction. The organizational system, the carefully constructed filing arrangement, the catalog tablets, the shelf markers, was scattered. Tablets that had been in perfect order were jumbled together. The knowledge encoded in their arrangement was lost, even though the tablets themselves survived. The library became a ruin, a buried chaos. Other libraries ended more quietly. As political power shifted, as dynasties rose and fell, as religious practices changed, some temple archives simply stopped being maintained. The scribes died or were reassigned. The younger generation wasn't trained in the old ways. The texts became less relevant to new rulers or new gods. Imagine the library at Nippur, say 400 BCE. Mesopotamian civilization is ancient by this point. Its glory days long past. The Persian Empire now controls the region. Aramaic, written with an alphabet on papyrus, is becoming the common written language for administration. Cuneiform, that ancient script pressed into clay, is becoming obsolete, maintained only by a shrinking class of traditionalist priests and scholars. The temple library still exists. The tablets are still there on their shelves, but fewer people come to consult them. The scribal school has fewer students. When a tablet becomes damaged, there's no one with time to copy it. The work of maintenance, once constant, once central to the temple's function, becomes sporadic, then rare, then stops altogether. One day, the last traditionally trained scribe walks out of the library. Maybe he knows he's the last. Maybe he doesn't. Probably doesn't think in those terms. He just knows he's old. His eyes are failing. There are no apprentices to take over his work. He locks the door behind him, walks away, dies, and no one takes his place. The library sits in darkness. Dust accumulates on the tablets. Without regular inspection, small problems become large ones. A crack in the roof lets in rain. Water damage affects a shelf of tablets. Mice make nests in the corners, gnawing on some tablets for the salt that human hands left on them over centuries of handling. More dust. More time. Eventually, even the memory of the library fades. Later occupants of the temple complex might not even know what's in those sealed rooms. The tablets become anonymous objects, ancient artifacts in a dead script that no one living can read. They become, in effect, rubbish, old broken clay in abandoned rooms, and then the temple itself is abandoned. Perhaps the city shrinks and the population moves elsewhere. Perhaps a new temple is built, and this old one is left to decay. The roof collapses. Walls crumble. Blowing sand buries the lower stories. Over decades, over centuries, the entire structure is reclaimed by the earth from which it was built. The tablets lie buried in darkness. They sit in the rubble of collapsed buildings. In soil that slowly accumulates over them, decades of dust storms, centuries of sediment deposition. The cities become mounds, tells unnatural-looking hills on the flat Mesopotamian plain. Shepherds graze their flocks on these mounds, not knowing that beneath their feet lie the archives of vanished civilizations. This is the long sleep hand. It lasted, in some cases, for over 2,000 years. From the last person who could read cuneiform until the first person who learned to read it again, to millennia of silence. 2,000 years during which these tablets, so carefully created and organized, sat unread in darkness. It's worth pausing here to feel the weight of this silence. Imagine the last tablet filed away by the last librarian. Imagine it sitting on its shelf, waiting to be consulted. Days pass, weeks, years. The dust deepens. The darkness is absolute. The tablet waits. Decades, centuries. The building collapses around it. The tablet is now buried beneath rubble and earth. Still waiting. More centuries. Millennia. Empires rise and fall above it. Languages evolve and die. Religions replace religions. The entire medieval period happens. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment. And the tablet sits, unchanging, unread, waiting in the dark. There's something almost unbearably sad about this all, that careful work. All that patient preservation, seemingly for nothing. The librarians who filed these tablets so carefully, who fought decay and error and damage, who maintained order year after year, their work seemed to end in failure. The libraries fell silent. The knowledge was lost. The darkness won. But here's the extraordinary thing. The darkness also protected. Buried tablets are safe from many of the things that destroy information. They're protected from exposure to air and light, which cause gradual degradation. They're protected from human interference from looters, from people who might have destroyed them deliberately, from well-meaning but ignorant people who might have thrown them away as rubbish. They're protected from the endless wars and invasions that swept across Mesopotamia over the centuries. The fired tablets, especially, proved remarkably durable. Clay is already earth. Burying it in earth is almost like returning it to its natural state. It doesn't rust like metal. It doesn't rot like organic materials. It doesn't dissolve like many minerals. It just sits there, patient, durable, waiting. And so, against all odds, through the long sleep, the tablets survived. Not all of them, many were lost to collapse, to water damage, to being reused as building material in later periods, but an enormous number survived, buried but intact, readable but unread, waiting for someone to find them and remember how to hear their voices. The ending of Mesopotamian Libraries wasn't a clean ending. It was a slow fade, a gradual descent into silence that happened over centuries at different rates in different places. The last cuneiform text we have is from 75 CEN, astronomical tablet from Babylon. By that point, cuneiform had been in use for over 3,000 years. The librarians of that final text couldn't have known they were among the last. Probably thought the tradition would continue. Probably assumed someone would come after them, but no one did. And the long sleep began, in the darkness, in the silence, in the deep earth of ruined cities. The tablets waited. The filing systems the librarians had created were destroyed. But the tablets themselves, those small rectangles of baked clay covered in wedge marks, endured. They held their messages, their lists, their stories, their calculations. They held memory even though there was no one left who could access that memory. The boring work of the librarians, the filing, cataloging, the careful preservation seemed to have been in vain. The library slept. The voices were silent. The great chain of textual transmission appeared to have been broken forever. But as we'll see, sleep is not death, and silence is not the end. Sometimes what's buried is simply waiting for the world to change enough that it can be heard again. Fast forward. Jump across 2,000 years of silence. Land in the 19th century, in the age of European imperialism and archaeological exploration. The world has changed utterly. Mesopotamia is now part of the Ottoman Empire. The ancient cities are mounds of earth. No one has read cuneiform in millennia. Most people don't even know it existed, but something is beginning to stir. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian libraries happened gradually, almost accidentally, as part of the larger 19th century European obsession with ancient civilizations. British and French archaeologists, competing for prestige and artifacts, began excavating sites in Iraq. They were looking for treasure, for impressive sculptures, for artifacts they could ship back to European museums. They weren't particularly looking for libraries, but they found them anyway. The first major discovery came in 1849, when British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard was excavating the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh. Layard was primarily interested in the massive stone sculptures, the human-headed winged bulls, the relief panels depicting military conquests. But in the palace complex, in room after room, he found something else. Fragments of clay tablets. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands at first. Layard didn't quite understand what he'd found. The tablets were covered in strange wedge-shaped marks that no one could read. They seemed less impressive than the monumental sculptures. But he was thorough, and he documented the find, noting particularly that the tablets seemed to have been stored in organized groups in specific rooms. Arranged on what appeared to have been wooden shelves, the wood itself had long since decayed. But the arrangement of tablets suggested shelving. The tablets were packed up somewhat carelessly by modern archaeological standards and shipped to the British Museum in London. They arrived as boxes of fragments, broken pieces, jumbled together without clear documentation of where each piece had been found. The organizational system that the ancient librarians had created was lost in this second destruction. This time caused not by violence, but by archaeological enthusiasm, without adequate recording methodology. But the tablets had been found. That was the crucial thing. After 2 millennia in darkness, Ashurbanipal's library had been rediscovered. Similar discoveries followed. French excavations at other Assyrian sites, German excavations at Babylon, discoveries of Sumerian tablets at sites in southern Iraq. By the late 19th century, it was becoming clear that ancient Mesopotamia had been a profoundly literate civilization, that these tablets represented thousands of years of written culture. But there was a problem. No one could read them. The script was completely unknown. It looked vaguely like bird tracks or abstract geometric patterns. Some marks seemed repeated, suggesting maybe it was writing, but no one knew what language it represented or how to pronounce it. The tablets sat in museum storage rooms. As silent and unreadable as they'd been in the earth, let's pause and appreciate the strangeness of this situation. Archaeologists had found entire libraries. The tablets were there, the texts intact, physically readable, but intellectually, they were still silent. Imagine finding 1 million books in a language you don't know. No dictionaries, no Rosetta Stone, no way to understand what you're looking at. That was the situation with cuneiform in the mid-19th century. The breakthrough came from several scholars, working on the problem from different angles. The key was the Behistun inscription, a massive trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face in Persia. It recorded the same text in 3 different scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, which used cuneiform. The Old Persian portion could be partly understood through its relationship to later Persian languages. A British Army officer and scholar named Henry Rawlinson spent years copying the Behistun inscription, literally dangling from ropes on a cliff face to reach the text. His copies, combined with the work of other scholars like Edward Hincks and Jules Oppert, gradually allowed the cuneiform script to be deciphered. The process took decades. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment, but a gradual accumulation of knowledge. First, recognizing that the script represented a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. Then, figuring out which signs represented syllables and which represented whole words. Then, understanding that many signs had multiple possible readings depending on context. Then, dealing with the fact that cuneiform had been used to write multiple different languages over its 3,000 year. By the 1870s, enough progress had been made that scholars could begin actually reading the tablets. And what they found was astonishing. They found royal inscriptions boasting of military conquests. They found legal codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi. They found mathematical texts that showed a sophisticated understanding of algebra and geometry. They found astronomical records tracking planetary movements with remarkable precision. They found medical texts, omen texts, religious hymns, creation myths, and they found the Epic of Gilgamesh. Discovery of Gilgamesh deserves special mention because it captured public imagination in a way that mathematical tables and omen lists didn't. George Smith, a young scholar working at the British Museum, was going through tablets from Nineveh when he realized he was reading a flood story, a story remarkably similar to the biblical flood narrative, but older, much older. The tablet he was reading came from Ashurbanipal's library in the 7th century BCE, but the story itself was clearly ancient even then. Smith's announcement of this discovery caused a sensation. An ancient flood story, contemporary with or predating the biblical version from a pagan civilization. The theological implications were debated intensely, but for our purposes, what matters is what Smith was actually looking at. A tablet that had been carefully cataloged and filed by Ashurbanipal's librarians. As 2,500 years earlier, that had survived the destruction of Nineveh, that had been buried for over 2,000 years, that had been excavated and shipped to London, and that was now being read again for the first time in millennia. The chain of textual transmission, broken for so long, was reconnecting. The librarians' work was being vindicated. The boring, patient organization they'd done filing tablets by subject, creating catalog entries. Preserving text systematically was what made it possible for modern scholars to navigate the vast collection. Even though the physical arrangement had been lost in excavation, the logical arrangement could be reconstructed by studying the tablets themselves, their colophons. The catalog tablets. Modern Assyriologists began to recognize that what they were dealing with wasn't just a random accumulation of texts, but deliberately organized libraries. They could see the categorical systems. They could identify catalog tablets and understand their function. They could trace copying chains through colophons. They began to appreciate that these ancient librarians had been doing sophisticated intellectual work, creating systems that served their civilization for centuries. More excavations followed. The library at Nippur was discovered, with its more than 30,000 tablets spanning 2,000 years. Smaller libraries at other sites. Private libraries of individual scholars. Each discovery added to the picture of ancient Mesopotamia as a profoundly literate culture that valued the written word and developed sophisticated systems for managing information. Process of publication and translation is still ongoing. There are still tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets in museum collections that haven't been fully translated or published. Assyriologists continue working through this vast corpus, slowly making it accessible to modern readers. Each tablet that gets translated is, in a sense, being filed again, cataloged in digital databases, translated into modern languages. Made accessible to scholars, the boring work continues, just with different tools. Instead of pressing styluses into clay, modern cuneiform librarians type on keyboards. Instead of brick shelves, they use digital databases. Instead of oil lamps, they use LED lights. But the fundamental task is the same: organizing knowledge, making it accessible, preserving it for the future, and now. When a scholar in Tokyo or Chicago or London wants to read a particular Mesopotamian omen text, they can search a database, find the catalog entry, locate the tablet in a museum collection, and read it either by examining the physical tablet or by consulting photographs and editions. The filing system the ancient librarians created has been rebuilt, translated into new media, but fundamentally carrying forward the same organizational principles. The rediscovery of these libraries restored voices that had been silent for 2 millennia. It gave us back texts that had been lost from human culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which profoundly influenced later literature. Mathematical techniques that anticipated later discoveries. Historical records that rewrote our understanding of ancient civilizations. Medical knowledge, legal systems, religious beliefs, all restored to human knowledge through the survival of carefully filed clay tablets. The boring work of ancient librarians, which seemed to end in failure when their civilization fell, turned out to have succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. They preserved their culture not just for their contemporaries or the next generation, but for humanity across millennia. The tablets they filed so carefully, the organizational systems they created, outlasted everything else about their civilization. The palaces crumbled. The empires fell. The gods were forgotten. But the clay tablets, properly filed and carefully preserved, survived. And so, in dusty museum workrooms, in archaeological excavation trenches, in scholarly publications, the conversation continues. Ancient scribes speak to modern scholars. The boring work of filing and cataloging bridges millennia. The long sleep ended. The voices returned. The libraries opened again in a new world, in new forms, but fundamentally unchanged in their purpose. To preserve and transmit human knowledge across the gulf of time, let's linger a bit longer in that moment of rediscovery, because there's something profound happening here that we haven't fully explored. We've talked about finding the tablets and learning to read the script, but what was it actually like intellectually, emotionally, to be among the first people in 2,000 years to hear these voices? Imagine being Henry Rawlinson, suspended by ropes on the Byhiston cliff face, copying inscription after inscription, knowing that these strange wedge marks might hold the key to an entire lost civilization, but not yet being able to read them. Day after day, the physical labor of reaching the inscriptions, The precision work of copying every mark exactly, all in service of a breakthrough that might never come. Or imagine being George Smith at the British Museum, sorting through thousands of tablet fragments, most of them damaged or partial, trying to piece together texts from fragments that had been jumbled together in excavation. The work would have been monumentally boring most of the time, examining fragment after fragment, trying to match breaks, comparing similar-looking pieces. And then, suddenly, recognizing a flood narrative, realizing what you're reading. The transition from boring puzzle solving to breathtaking, discovery happening in a single moment of comprehension. The decipherment of cuneiform required a particular kind of patience that parallels the patience of the original librarians. It required the willingness to do repetitive, comparative work comparing inscriptions, building up vocabulary sign by sign, testing hypotheses about grammar and syntax. It required living with uncertainty, with partial understanding, with the knowledge that your current interpretation might be wrong, and you'd have to start over. The scholars who cracked cuneiform weren't necessarily the most brilliant linguists of their time. They were the ones willing to do boring work consistently over decades. They were the ones who could maintain focus on a single problem for years. They were, in their own way, like the ancient scribes, they were learning to read patient, methodical, willing to work slowly toward understanding. Consider the problem of homophone. In cuneiform, the fact that the same sign could have multiple different readings depending on context. The sign that means life could also mean arrow or could represent a particular syllable. How do you figure this out? You compare hundreds of contexts. You notice patterns. You test hypotheses. You build up knowledge incrementally, one small certainty at a time. This is exactly the kind of work that doesn't make for exciting storytelling. There's no dramatic moment of genius insight. Well, there are small ones, but they come embedded in months of tedious groundwork. Instead, there's the slow accretion of understanding. The gradual transition from "I have no idea what this says" to "I can roughly understand this" to "I can translate this confidently," as more scholars joined the effort. As more tablets were published, the pace of progress increased, but it was still fundamentally boring work. Publishing an edition of a tablet meant copying every sign exactly, preparing a transliteration showing what signs were used, creating a translation, adding notes about difficult passages. A scholar might spend years on a single major text, but through this work, voices began to emerge. Not just the meanings of individual words, but the personalities of the writers. The officious tone of administrative texts, the elevated language of religious hymns, the practical directness of medical prescriptions, the pompous boasting of royal inscriptions, the wit and wisdom of proverb collections, and sometimes incredibly, you could hear individual voices across millennia. A scribe's colophon that complained about his tired hands. A student's practice tablet with errors that a teacher had corrected. A librarian's note about a damaged tablet that needed to be recopied. These tiny human moments preserved in clay. There's something deeply moving about this. These weren't gods or legendary heroes. They were people doing ordinary work. That work left traces that outlasted everything else about them. We don't know what most of them look like. We don't know their family histories or personal dreams, but we have their work, their careful marks in clay. And through those marks, we can touch something of who they were. The act of translation itself became a form of filing, a new kind of organization. As cuneiform texts were translated into modern languages and published, they were being cataloged again, sorted by type, dated, assigned museum numbers, cross-referenced. The work the ancient librarians did in physical space, modern scholars were doing in intellectual space. Digital technology has accelerated this process remarkably. Today, there are extensive cuneiform databases where you can search for specific words or phrases across thousands of texts. You can find every instance of a particular god's name, every mention of a specific city, every occurrence of a mathematical term. This would have been impossible even 50 years ago, let alone in the early days of decipherment. But the fundamental task remains the same, making knowledge accessible. The ancient librarians did it by physical filing and memorization. Modern scholars do it through databases and publications. Different tools, same goal. The boring work continues. Transformed, but not essentially changed. There's also been a kind of recovery of appreciation for the librarians themselves. Early Assyriology focused on the content of texts, what they said about history, religion, science. But as the field matured, scholars began to recognize the importance of understanding how texts were organized, how libraries functioned, how knowledge was managed. Studies of ancient libraries became a specialty within Assyriology. Scholars examined catalog tablets, analyzed filing systems, reconstructed the physical arrangement of storage rooms based on where tablets were found in excavation. They began to appreciate that the librarians weren't just passive custodians, but active intellectual workers who shaped how knowledge was accessed and transmitted. This recognition of librarians' intellectual work is important. It's easy to see authorship, the creation of new texts, as the real intellectual work, while treating organization and preservation as mere maintenance. But the ancient librarians understood something that we're relearning in the digital age. Without organization, without good systems for storage and retrieval, information is effectively useless. Having 1,000 texts is meaningless. If you can't find the one you need, the parallels to modern information management are striking. We face fundamentally similar problems. How to categorize information that doesn't fit neatly into single categories. How to deal with duplication and versioning. How to preserve digital information for the long term. How to make vast collections searchable and accessible. The tools are different, but the intellectual challenges are remarkably similar to what Mesopotamian librarians faced, and we're still learning from them. Studying ancient filing systems has influenced modern archival theory. The robustness of their categorical systems, the fact that we can still understand them millennia later, suggests principles of organization that transcend particular technologies. The care they took with preservation has informed best practices in conservation, in a very real sense. Modern librarians and information scientists are the intellectual descendants of those ancient clay tablet filers. The chain of transmission didn't just preserve the content of texts, it preserved the practice of librarianship itself. The accumulated wisdom about how to organize and preserve knowledge as each tablet is translated. As each text is published and cataloged, we're participating in the same work the ancient librarians did. We're fighting the same battle against entropy and forgetting. We're making the same boring, essential effort to maintain order and accessibility. The medium has changed from clay to paper to digital files. But the commitment to preservation, to organization, to making knowledge available across time remains constant, and so the voices keep emerging from the clay. Medical texts teach us about ancient healing practices. Astronomical texts reveal sophisticated mathematical methods. Literary texts let us hear stories told 4,000 years ago. Legal texts show us how ancient people structured their societies. All of this was possible because librarians filed these texts carefully, preserved them systematically, and created organizational systems robust enough to survive even the collapse of the civilization that created them. The boring work of decipherment continues. There are still texts being translated for the first time, still fragments being pieced together, still obscure passages being clarified. The work probably will never be completely done. There will always be difficult texts, ambiguous passages, fragmentary pieces that resist full understanding. But that's okay. The work continues. Patient scholars do the boring, essential work of translation and publication. Museums preserve the physical tablets. Databases organize the growing corpus of translated texts. And slowly, the conversation between ancient and modern continues. Mediated by librarians, ancient and modern, all doing the same fundamental work, preserving human knowledge, organizing it, making it accessible to the future. The clay speaks. Slowly, haltingly, with gaps and uncertainties, but it speaks. And we listen across the gulf of millennia, hearing voices that were preserved by the boring, patient work of people who filed tablets for a living. Their work mattered. It matters still. As we near the end of this journey through ancient libraries and the librarians who maintained them, it's worth pausing to reflect on what this all means. What can we learn from the boring work of filing clay tablets 4,000 years ago? Why does this story matter beyond its historical interest? First, and most obviously, there's the lesson about preservation and time. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are among the oldest human documents that survive in significant quantities. They've outlasted papyrus, parchment, and early paper. They've outlasted the civilizations that created them. They've survived wars, fires, floods, and millennia of burial. This survival wasn't accidental. It was the result of conscious choices about materials and methods. Clay tablets, especially fired ones, are remarkably durable. But more importantly, the organizational systems that librarians created made the tablets findable, which made them valuable, which motivated people to preserve them carefully. There's a lesson here for our own age. We live in a time of unprecedented information creation. More data is generated now in a single day than existed in the entire ancient world, but how much of it will survive? Digital formats become obsolete quickly. Storage media degrade. File formats require specific software that may not exist in 50 years, let alone centuries. The boring work of preservation, maintaining backups, migrating data to new formats, documenting file structures is as essential now as it was in ancient Mesopotamia, and it's equally unglamorous. No one gets famous for maintaining backup systems or updating file format documentation, but this work is what makes long-term preservation possible. Second, there's the lesson about organization as an intellectual act. The Mesopotamian librarians who created categorical systems and filing arrangements weren't just doing mechanical sorting. They were making intellectual judgments about how knowledge relates to itself, about what categories are useful, about how future users might want to access information. These decisions shaped how knowledge was used in their civilization. A well-organized library made scholarship possible. A poorly organized one, or a disorganized accumulation of texts, would have been nearly useless. Organization is what transformed clay into culture. In our own time, we might think we've solved this problem with digital search tools. Why does organization matter when you can just search for keywords? But anyone who's tried to find something in a poorly organized digital archive knows that search is not a substitute for good organization. Search only works if documents are properly tagged, if metadata is accurate, if the organizational structure makes sense. The boring work of organization still matters. Third, there's the lesson about the value of routine and repetition. The ancient librarians showed up day after day and did essentially the same work, filing tablets, maintaining order, checking for damage, copying deteriorating texts. This repetitive routine might seem numbing, but it was precisely this consistency that made preservation possible. We live in a culture that often celebrates disruption, innovation, and radical change. And certainly, innovation matters. But some things require not innovation, but faithful continuation. Libraries don't need to be constantly reinvented, they need to be consistently maintained. The boring daily work of keeping systems running, keeping collections organized, keeping preservation on track, this is what actually sustains cultural memory. There's something almost countercultural about valorizing boring consistency in an age that prizes exciting novelty. But the ancient librarians remind us that some of the most important work is work that stays the same, that resists novelty, that maintains continuity across time. Fourth, there's the lesson about humility. The librarians who filed these tablets mostly didn't sign their work. They weren't seeking fame or recognition. They understood themselves as links in a chain receiving knowledge from the past, preserving it in the present, passing it to the future. Their individual contribution was small, but the cumulative effect across generations was enormous. This kind of humility is rare in our celebrity-obsessed culture. We tend to lionize individual genius, the breakthrough insight, the revolutionary innovation. But most human progress doesn't work that way. Most progress is cumulative, built on countless small contributions by people who will never be famous. The librarians weren't geniuses. They were skilled professionals doing careful, consistent work. And that work mattered more, in the long run, than the achievements of kings and conquerors. The royal palaces crumbled. The imperial ambitions were forgotten. But the clay tablets properly filed remain. Fifth, there's the lesson about the relationship between the mundane and the meaningful. The work of filing tablets was boring, but it preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's great literary achievements. It preserved mathematical discoveries that influenced later civilizations. It preserved legal principles that shaped concepts of justice. The boring work enabled the meaningful work to survive. We often treat meaning and mundanity as opposites. Meaningful work is exciting and important. Mundane work is boring and trivial. But the ancient libraries show us that mundanity often serves meaning. The spectacular achievements require mundane support. The inspiration needs the perspiration, and specifically, it needs the boring organizational perspiration that makes knowledge accessible across time. Sixth, there's the lesson about what actually lasts. Empires are temporary. Political power is fleeting. Military victories are reversed. But knowledge, properly preserved and organized, can survive for millennia. The work that seemed most boring, filing clay tablets, has turned out to produce the most enduring results. This suggests a reframing of what important means. We tend to think of powerful people doing dramatic things as important. Kings, generals, prophets, these seem like the real movers of history. But in the long view, the anonymous scribes preserving knowledge might have had more lasting impact. Their work shaped civilizations they never knew would exist. Finally, there's the lesson about the fight against entropy. Entropy, the tendency of ordered systems to become disordered. For information to degrade, for organization to collapse into chaos is one of the fundamental principles of physics. It applies to information just as much as to physical systems. The librarians of ancient Mesopotamia were fighting entropy. Every time they filed a tablet correctly, they imposed order against chaos. Every time they copied a damaged tablet, they fought decay. Every time they maintained their organizational system, they resisted the natural tendency toward disorder. They ultimately lost this fight. The libraries fell silent. The organization collapsed, chaos returned. But the loss was temporary. The tablets survived, buried, but intact. And when they were rediscovered, when the organizational systems were reconstructed, when the texts were translated and published, the fight against entropy resumed. We're still fighting that same fight. Every backup, every catalog entry, every preservation effort is a push against entropy. We can't win permanently. Entropy always increases eventually, but we can hold it off for a while. We can preserve knowledge for another generation, another century, perhaps another millennium. The boring work is the work that fights entropy. And fighting entropy, even temporarily, is how civilizations persist across time. Standing in the ruins of ancient libraries, looking at tablets that have survived millennia, you feel a strange connection across time. The librarians who filed these tablets had the same concerns we do. How do we organize this? How do we make it findable? How do we preserve it? They faced the same entropy, the same pressure of time, the same challenge of maintaining order. They did it with different tools: clay instead of computers, shelves instead of databases, manual labor instead of automation. But the fundamental commitment was the same: to preservation, to organization, to making knowledge accessible across time. And their success, the fact that we can read these tablets today, that we can understand their organizational systems, that we can appreciate their careful work, is both inspiring and instructive. It suggests that boring, patient, consistent work actually matters, that humble maintenance is a form of heroism, that filing things correctly is an act of cultural significance. The dust holds lessons. The clay speaks wisdom, and the message is simple. Do the boring work. Do it carefully. Do it consistently. Because the boring work is what lasts. The boring work is what actually preserves civilization across the great abyss of time. The librarians knew this. They showed up day after day to their unglamorous work. filing tablets in dim lamplight, fighting decay and chaos, one careful placement at a time. They probably didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just doing their jobs. But heroes they were, and the tablets they filed so carefully testified to it still. 4,000 years later, speaking from the dust about the enduring value of boring. Patient, humble work. Night is falling now. Over the ruins of ancient cities, the sun sets across the Mesopotamian plain, long shadows stretching across tells and excavation trenches, across the remnants of libraries that once held the accumulated knowledge of civilizations, in museums around the world, in climate-controlled cases, the tablets rest. Small rectangles of baked clay, covered in wedge-shaped marks, silent under glass. But their silence is not empty. It's full of voices waiting to be heard by anyone who takes the time to learn their language. In university libraries, scholars still work with these texts, translating, interpreting, publishing. The boring work continues, transformed but not essentially changed. The chain of textual transmission, broken for millennia, has been restored. The librarian's work goes on, in new hands, with new tools, but with the same patient dedication. Somewhere, perhaps, a graduate student is cataloging newly excavated tablets, assigning them numbers, photographing them, beginning the slow process of translation. She doesn't think of herself as doing the same work as those ancient librarians, but she is. Filing, organizing, preserving, making knowledge accessible. The fundamental tasks remain unchanged. Somewhere else. A conservator examines a damaged tablet, assessing whether it can be safely handled or needs stabilization. The concern for preservation, the fight against decay, continues. Different materials, different techniques, but the same commitment to making things last. And somewhere, perhaps, a child visits a museum and stops at a case containing clay tablets. She looks at the strange marks, reads the English translation on the museum label, and wonders, who wrote this? How did they live? What were they trying to say? The conversation across time continues, mediated by the boring work of countless people who cared about preservation. Let's return, one last time, to that librarian Nipper. Imagine it not in its ruined state, but as it was, long ago, in its prime. Late afternoon, the light through the high windows turning golden. The air thick with clay dust and lamp smoke. The shelves lined with tablets, each one in its proper place. A librarian, let's call him by the name we used before, Enlil. Though he could be any of the hundreds of nameless librarians who worked in these archives, completes his day's work. He's filed the new tablets that arrived. He's checked the shelves for signs of damage. He's copied a section of a deteriorating text. Ordinary work, mundane work, the same work he did yesterday and will do tomorrow. He extinguishes his lamp. The flame gutters and dies, and the room dims slightly. He walks between the shelves one last time, a final check, his hand trailing along the tablets. Feeling their familiar texture. Everything is in order. Everything is where it should be. He steps outside. The evening air is cool after the stuffiness of the archive. The temple complex is quieting for the night. Soon, the evening offerings will be made, the evening prayers said, and then darkness will settle over Nipper, over the library, over the thousands of tablets resting in their careful arrangements. In the darkness, the tablets wait. They've been waiting for thousands of years now, some of them, waiting to be read, to be consulted, to have their information accessed, and they'll wait longer still, decades, centuries, millennia, if necessary. Clay is patient. The boring work that Enlil did today, filing those tablets, checking those shelves, copying that text, seems so small in the moment. Just another day's labor, forgotten almost as soon as it's done. But that work is part of something larger. Each properly filed tablet is a victory against forgetting. Each careful preservation decision is a gift to the future. Each maintained organizational system is a bridge across time. The work continues even after Enlil is gone. Other librarians take his place. The tablets accumulate. The collection grows. And then, eventually, the work stops. The library falls silent. The long sleep begins, but even in sleep, the tablets preserve. Even buried in darkness, they hold their memories. Even unread for millennia, they remain ready, waiting for the moment when someone will rediscover them, relearn their language, reconstruct their organization, hear their voices again. That moment came. The tablets were found. The language was deciphered. The libraries opened again, in new forms, in a new world. And the boring work resumed, cataloging, preserving, organizing, making knowledge accessible, and it continues still. In museums, in universities, in databases, and publications, scholars and librarians carry forward the work that began in those ancient archives. The tools have changed. The medium has transformed. But the commitment remains to preserve human knowledge, to organize it, to pass it forward to futures we'll never see. This is the lesson. Finally, that the ancient librarians teach us. The boring work matters. The patient routine matters. The humble maintenance matters. Not because it's exciting or glamorous or immediately rewarding, but because it's what actually preserves civilization across the vast reaches of time. The tablets rest under glass, silent and patient. But their silence is eloquent. It speaks of the enduring value of careful work. It testifies to the power of systematic preservation. It reminds us that what seems most mundane might, in the long view, prove most essential. Night deepens. The museums close. The libraries lock their doors. And in the darkness, in the quiet, the tablets wait as they've been waiting for millennia, more if necessary. The boring work is done for today. And tomorrow, it will begin again. One tablet at a time, one careful mark at a time. One small victory against forgetting at a time. The library sleeps. The lamps fade. The scribes rest. But the work continues, echoing forward through time. A chain of preservation that connects the ancient past to the unknowable future. And somewhere in that chain, whether we recognize it or not, we all participate. Every time we organize information thoughtfully, every time we preserve something carefully, every time we maintain a system patiently, we're doing the work the ancient librarians did. We're fighting the same fight against entropy and forgetting. The clay holds its secrets gently, releasing them slowly to those patient enough to listen. And the message whispered across 4,000 years is simple and profound. Do the boring work with care and consistency. Because the boring work is what actually lasts. The gentle end arrives not with drama, but with peace, the peace of work completed, of order maintained, of knowledge preserved for another day. The tablets rest. The voices fade to whispers. And in the settling dust of centuries, there is stillness. Sleep now. The library watches over its memories. The boring work is done. And in the morning, whether in ancient Nippur or modern times, the work will continue, patient and necessary, linking past to future through the simple act of careful preservation. The clay sleeps. History hums beneath the surface of time. And the ancient librarians, nameless and forgotten, have done their work well. The boring work that actually saved civilization, the patient filing that conquered time, rests now. The tablets keep their vigil. The story is told, and the gentle end settles like dust over everything, soft and patient and eternal.